The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, the expensive kind, the kind of oppressive, sanitized silence that only exists behind the triple-paned glass of private VIP suites at Stanford Hospital, where the tech elite recover from their high-profile breakdowns away from the prying eyes of the press. I stared at the pristine white ceiling, trying to anchor myself to reality. My mouth tasted like copper and ash. A brutal, rhythmic throbbing hammered against the back of my skull, sending sharp needles of pain behind my eyes. I tried to lift my left arm, but it felt leaden tethered to an IV drip that beeped with an agonizingly slow, rhythmic tempo. Tick, tick, tick. Then the fragments of the evening began to stitch themselves back together. The gala, the flashing cameras of the San Francisco tech press, the launch of our new cellular regeneration line, the private after-party at L'Avenue, the celebratory toast, Julian sliding a crystal flute into my hand, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners with that boyish charm that had stolen my heart 8 years ago, the first sip, the sudden violent tilt of the room, the marble floor rushing up to meet my face. A nurse had probably explained everything to me while I was drifting in and out of consciousness. But whatever heavy-duty sedative they had pumped into my system had left my short-term memory blurry around the edges. I slowly turned my head, fighting a wave of intense nausea. The room didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a 5-star penthouse in Santana Row. There was a minimalist Italian leather sofa by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive arrangement of white orchids on a quartz table, and a hidden smart television flush against the walnut-paneled wall. Through the glass, the distant lights of Palo Alto shimmered beneath a foggy, charcoal-grey California sky. For a fraction of a second, the rational, workaholic side of my brain tried to rationalize it. I had spent the last decade building Aura Biocosmetics from a hyper-niche Stanford research project into a global multi-billion-dollar eco-biotech empire. I was 42. Chronic stress sleep deprivation and the relentless pressure of a looming Wall Street IPO came with the territory. Maybe my body had simply forced a hard reset. Then, I heard the voices. They drifted through the half-open door of the adjoining private lounge. "Are you sure she took it?" The whisper was sharp, frantic, and instantly recognizable. It belonged to Chloe, my best friend of 25 years. The woman who had held my hair back when we were broke college students, the maid of honor at my wedding, the creative director, whose failing fashion line I had personally bankrolled with a 7-figure check just last quarter. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locking into stone. A quiet, low chuckle vibrated through the air. "Relax," Julian's voice replied, dripping with a smooth, terrifyingly calm confidence. "She drank the whole thing. The doctors think it's a stress-induced cardiac episode. By tomorrow morning, the emergency proxy activates. Everything, the trust, the patent rights, the entire Aura portfolio will be ours." "Julian, if the toxicology report—" "There won't be a tox report," my husband interrupted his tone, turning icy, commanding. "I handled it. Stop panicking. We're hours away from the finish line." My blood ran completely cold. The room seemed to spin again, but this time it wasn't the drug. It was the sheer suffocating weight of reality. The universe didn't tilt. It shattered. Every anomaly, every strange look, every unexplained financial discrepancy over the last 12 months suddenly aligned into a horrific, flawless mosaic of betrayal. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were waiting for me to die. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. When you build a billion-dollar empire from nothing in the cutthroat trenches of Silicon Valley, panic is a luxury you train yourself to outgrow. Instead, my mind transitioned into pure, cold survival mode. Facts first. Emotions later. Slowly, carefully, I slid my right hand across the Egyptian cotton sheets. My fingers brushed against the bedside table and found my iPhone. The screen lit up, illuminating the dark room. There were 23 missed calls, 11 from my executive assistant, 3 from the head of corporate security, 9 from a restricted number I knew by heart. I opened my encrypted messaging app, bypassed the biometric lock, and pulled up a thread that had remained dormant for weeks. I typed 4 words to my attorney Gavin Brooks. Execute the protocol now. I stared at the screen. The 3 grey dots appeared almost instantaneously. Gavin was awake. Of course he was. He was the chief legal counsel of Aura, a man who slept 4 hours a night and possessed the predatory instincts of a great white shark. The dots vanished. His reply was a single word. Finally. Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are you okay?" Just finally. Because Gavin knew. Because for the past 2 months behind closed doors in soundproof rooms, we had been meticulously drafting a legal contingency plan for this exact, unthinkable scenario. We had built a financial fortress brick by brick, law by law. I just hadn't been ready to pull the trigger. I had been clinging to the pathetic, desperate hope that the data was wrong, that my husband still loved me, that my best friend wasn't a monster. I slipped the phone back under the pillow and closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to remain slow and steady. The strangest part about that moment wasn't the fear. It was the lack of it. The grief would come later, the mourning of an 8-year marriage, the agonizing loss of a 25-year friendship, the shattering of the life I thought I knew. But right now, as I lay in the expensive silence of that Stanford hospital room, listening to the muffled whispers of the 2 people who had just tried to end my life, a dark, pristine clarity took over. My name is Audrey Vance. I am the CEO of Aura Biocosmetics. Julian and Chloe thought they were stepping into their dawn of absolute wealth. They thought they had engineered the perfect corporate execution. But they forgot one fundamental rule of the Valley. You never ever try to hostile take over the person who wrote the code. And by tomorrow morning, their entire world was going to catch fire. To understand how a tech world powerhouse like Audrey Vance ends up in a bio-monitored cage at Stanford Hospital, you have to understand the sheer blinding speed of Silicon Valley. I built Aura Biocosmetics in the brutal, hyper-accelerated trenches of the Palo Alto startup scene. While my peers in their 20s were hopping from casual flings to music festivals, I was living on espresso, Adderall, and venture capital pitches, converting complex cellular regeneration science into an eco-friendly commercial juggernaut. I didn't just chase goals, I hunted them. Chloe had been my counterweight. We met during our sophomore year at Lowell High School in San Francisco. She was everything I wasn't: vibrant, unbothered by the future, and possessed an innate, effortless charisma that drew people in like moths to a flame. While I analyzed data, Chloe analyzed aesthetics. Over the next 2 decades, as I climbed the corporate ladder, Chloe floated through the creative world. She launched a boutique fashion label, dabbled in influencer marketing, and curated an enviable high-end lifestyle. I loved her because she represented a normal, grounded world outside my boardroom. Or so I stupidly thought. When her luxury brand began bleeding capital last quarter, I didn't hesitate. I wrote a 7-figure corporate sponsorship check from Aura to bail her out, thinking I was saving a sister. Then there was Julian. I met him 4 years after Aura hit its first $100 million valuation. I was 40, exhausted, and profoundly lonely. Julian was an independent creative director, completely detached from the cutthroat tech bro culture that constantly surrounded me. He didn't talk about quarterly projections or Series C funding. He brought me hand-poured coffee, made me laugh during late-night panics, and taught me how to breathe. For a woman who had spent her entire life protecting her vulnerabilities, Julian felt like a safe harbor. Our wedding in Maui was a fairy tale splashed across the pages of Vogue. For the first 7 years, our marriage felt like a masterclass in modern bliss. We bought a mid-century modern estate in the Los Altos Hills, hosted intimate dinners for tech royalty, and spent weekends sailing around the Farallon Islands. The first hairline fracture in our perfect life appeared exactly 12 months ago. It didn't start with lipstick on a collar or late-night whispers. It started with the cold, hard metrics of finance. Julian had never shown an interest in my wealth. He preferred to let my accountants and wealth managers handle the fine print while he focused on his art. But suddenly, he became intensely curious about the architecture of my estate. The shift was subtle at first. A casual question over Sunday brunch about how Aura's voting shares were distributed. A midnight conversation about our prenuptial agreement. Then his inquiries grew more frequent, more calculated, and dangerously specific. One evening, while we were preparing dinner in our high-end kitchen, Julian poured 2 glasses of Pinot Noir and leaned against the marble island. "Babe?" He started, his tone light, but his eyes intensely focused. "If the board ever tries to stage a coup before the IPO, say, if you were temporarily incapacitated by health or stress, does the corporate charter allow an immediate proxy to take over your voting bloc?" I froze, my paring knife hovering over a head of organic kale. I looked up, studying his face. "That's an oddly specific corporate governance question, Julian." He forced a soft, easy laugh, flashing that boyish smile. "Just reading an article about the OpenAI board drama. Wanted to make sure my brilliant wife was protected, that's all." I smiled back, but a cold, heavy stone settled in my stomach. Tech tycoons in their 40s talk about estate planning, yes. But they don't talk about incapacitation with that kind of academic precision. Within weeks, a second variable entered the equation: Chloe. She began appearing everywhere. She crashed our private charity galas, joined us for impromptu dinners in Napa Valley, and dropped by Aura's corporate headquarters in Cupertino without calling. More disturbingly, she began texting Julian constantly, far more than any casual friendship between a wife's best friend and her husband ever warranted. Whenever I mentioned the sudden closeness, both of them had flawless, highly rehearsed explanations. They were collaborating on a new marketing campaign. They were designing VIP gift bags for the IPO launch party. The excuses were too clean, too perfect. The definitive proof arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. Julian was in the master shower upstairs, the steam fogging up the glass. His iPhone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen illuminating the dark wood. I walked over, intending to silence it. A text preview from Chloe popped up on the lock screen. "Can't stop thinking about how your hands felt last night." My heart stopped. My ribs felt like they were collapsing inward. But before my brain could even process the emotional devastation of the betrayal, a second message flashed immediately underneath it. The new mood boards for the Aura campaign. Look phenomenal, by the way. Talk to you at the office. I stood paralyzed in the center of our bedroom, staring at the blank screen. A normal wife would have screamed, confronted him the moment he stepped out of the shower, and thrown his designer luggage out the window. But I wasn't just a wife. I was a CEO. And I knew that in any high-stakes crisis, the person who reacts with emotion loses. I didn't confront him. Instead, I did what I had always done whenever faced with a catastrophic threat to my ecosystem. I gathered data. 3 weeks after that text message, I walked into a nondescript high-security office building in downtown San Francisco. I wasn't there to see an ordinary private investigator who handled cheap matrimonial surveillance. I was there to see Marcus Vance. Despite our matching last names, we weren't related. Marcus was a legendary former inspector, a former federal cybercrimes agent who specialized in corporate espionage and high-net-worth asset protection. Our first meeting was devoid of theatricality. Marcus sat behind a sleek metallic desk, his grey eyes scanning me with the analytical detachedness of an AI algorithm. "Why are you here, Mrs. Vance?" he asked bluntly. "I think my marriage is a lie." I replied, my voice steady. though my hands were clenched tightly inside my coat pockets. And I think my company might be collateral damage. Marcus nodded slowly, opening a clean digital file. Do you want reassurance, or do you want the truth? I built a billion-dollar empire on data, Marcus. Reassurance is for people who can't handle the market. Give me the truth. 3 months before I woke up paralyzed in that Stanford 5 IP suite, Marcus walked into my executive office at Aura headquarters, carrying an encrypted biometric external drive and a single slim black folder. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sprawling campus below, where trucks bearing the Aura logo were loading shipments for global distribution. Usually that sight filled me with a deep, visceral sense of pride. That day it made me feel like a target standing in a glass house. Marcus didn't speak immediately. He plugged the drive into my secure terminal and pulled up a massive web of data visualization. The affair is a foregone conclusion, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave as he flipped open the black folder. The first dozen high-resolution photographs materialized on my screen. Julian and Chloe checking into a secluded boutique hotel in Carmel by the Sea. Julian and Chloe holding hands at an underground restaurant in Oakland. Kissing in the back of an Uber. Digital breadcrumbs of a passionate, reckless romance that had been thriving right under my nose for at least 14 months. 14 months. The timeline felt like a physical blow to my sternum. They had been sleeping together while sitting at my Thanksgiving table, while celebrating my birthday, while Julian toasted to my health at our anniversary gala. I'm sorry, Marcus muttered quietly. Don't be, I said, my voice icy, completely detached from the grief that was trying to claw its way up my throat. I'm a data scientist, Marcus. Keep going. Good, Marcus said, zooming in on a complex financial flowchart. Because the infidelity isn't what should concern you. Look at Julian's shadow financial profile. He brought up a series of highly encrypted bank records linked to shell corporations, registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. Over the past year, Julian had initiated multiple large-scale wire transfers, liquidating his personal investment accounts and moving vast sums of money into high-yield, anonymous cryptocurrency wallets. I frowned, leaning closer to the terminal. What am I looking at? Is he hoarding money for a massive divorce settlement? No, Marcus said, his grey eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill straight down my spine. A cheating spouse preparing for a divorce tries to hide assets so they don't have to split them. Julian isn't hiding assets, Mrs. Vance. He's liquidating everything he owns to build immediate liquid capital. He's positioning himself for a massive, sudden acquisition. The temperature in my office seemed to plummet. An acquisition of what? Of Aura, Marcus said flatly. Look at the digital communication logs we intercepted between him and Chloe. They aren't just sexting. They are actively analyzing your corporate governance structure, your insurance policies, and your medical history. Marcus pulled up an encrypted chat transcript. Chloe had messaged Julian via an anonymous app. Are you certain the cellular patent transfer occurs automatically if she's incapacitated? Julian's response was a chilling 5-word sentence. By then, it won't matter. That was the exact moment the battle lines were drawn. I wasn't dealing with a cliched midlife crisis or a messy divorce. I was dealing with a corporate execution masquerading as a domestic tragedy. That same afternoon, I brought the encrypted drive to Gavin Brooks, my chief legal counsel. For 2 hours, Gavin reviewed the data, his jaw clenching tightly. When he finally looked up, he locked the heavy mahogany door of his private conference room. Audrey, Gavin said, his corporate lawyer veneer dropping completely. We need to assume they are playing for keeps. If you drop dead, or if you end up in a coma, Julian becomes the sole executor of your estate and inherits your absolute voting block on the Aura board. He could sell the company, liquidate the patents to our competitors, and walk away with $1 billion before the IPO even launches. Then we build a wall, I said, my voice hardening into pure steel. A wall so high and so thick that even if they kill me, they won't get a single dime. For the next 2 months, Gavin, Marcus, and I worked in absolute terrifying secrecy. We didn't file for divorce. We didn't make a scene. Every single night I went home to the Los Altos Hills estate, ate dinner with my murderer, let him kiss my cheek, and pretended everything was perfect. But during the day, we constructed an airtight legal fortress. We quietly restructured Aura's corporate charter. We moved all my personal wealth real estate holdings, and crucially, my proprietary cellular regeneration patents into an irrevocable trust. The trust was governed by a secret multi-layered board consisting of Gavin, an independent Swiss bank, and an emergency corporate proxy that automatically locked out Julian the second any medical anomaly occurred. Legally permanently, I stripped him of his future fortune before he even realized the trap was set. But the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place just 3 days ago. Marcus tracked an anonymous account Julian used on the dark web. Alongside the financial movements, Julian had made highly specialized inquiries about an undetectable synthetic peptide, a compound that mimics a stress-induced cardiac arrest and leaves the body within 4 hours. The trap was set. Julian had bought the weapon. And tonight at the L'Avenue Gala, he had finally pulled the trigger. They thought they had won. But as I lay in that Stanford hospital bed, listening to their muffled whispers fade down the hallway, I knew the morning sun would bring a reckoning they never saw coming. The 2 months following my discovery of Julian's dark web activity were a masterclass in psychological warfare. In the cutthroat arena of Silicon Valley, executives often talk about stealth mode, operating a company in complete secrecy until you are ready to disrupt the market. I took that concept and applied it to my survival. Every morning, I woke up next to a man who was actively calculating the lethal dosage of a synthetic peptide. I watched him pour my coffee, monitored the slight tremor in his hands, and forced myself to smile back when he leaned down to kiss my forehead. It was an agonizing exercise in emotional detachment. During the day, however, the real war was waged in the soundproof subterranean conference rooms of Gavin Brooks's luxury law firm in downtown San Francisco. Gavin was a corporate apex predator. He didn't just understand the law. He manipulated it like a grandmaster playing three-dimensional chess. If we file for a standard divorce now, Audrey, we trigger a public relations nightmare, Gavin explained during one of our midnight strategy sessions, sliding a thick stack of legal briefs across the table. The tech blogs will pick it up instantly. Aura's valuation will plummet 40% before the Wall Street IPO, and Julian will use the chaos to claim half of your unvested stock options. We cannot let him weaponize the legal system against you. I don't just want a divorce, Gavin, I replied, staring at the complex corporate flowcharts pinned to the wall. I want him entirely erased from the financial architecture of my life. I want him to realize he's broke the exact second he thinks he's won. Gavin smiled a cold, razor-sharp expression. Then we build the irrevocable firewall. For 60 days, we systematically dismantled Julian's future. Gavin drafted a highly confidential asset protection instrument called the Vance Legacy Trust. Under California law, an irrevocable trust is notoriously difficult to penetrate if structured correctly. We quietly transferred 95% of my liquid capital, my real estate holdings in Aspen and Maui, and crucially, the primary intellectual property patents for Aura's cellular regeneration tech into this new entity. The masterstroke, however, was the corporate governance override. We amended Aura's corporate charter with an emergency medical proxy clause. If I were ever admitted to an ICU or suffered a disabling medical event, my voting block didn't default to my spouse. Instead, absolute control of the company immediately fractured and distributed among a 3-person shadow board: Gavin, our chief technology officer, and a premier private banking firm in Zurich. Julian was completely insulated from power. He was being legally disinherited in real time. Yet every evening he sat in our living room completely oblivious, sipping scotch and thinking he was a genius. People are at their most dangerous when they believe victory is inevitable. Julian's arrogance was his Achilles heel. Because he viewed me as an overworked, emotionally starved wife who was desperate to keep his affection, he never questioned the subtle shifts in our environment. He never noticed that the security codes to the Los Altos Hills estate had been updated under the guise of a system-wide corporate audit. He never noticed that my personal assistant, a fiercely loyal woman named Eleanor, was blind copying every single one of his calendar invites directly to Marcus Vance's secure server. Marcus was working around the clock, intercepting the encrypted communication logs between Julian and Chloe. The deeper he dug, the more chilling the timeline became. They were no longer discussing the affair, they were discussing logistics. One intercept from late November stood out with terrifying clarity. Chloe had messaged Julian via their encrypted app, "Are we still on schedule for the December gala?" The market volatility is making me nervous. Julian's reply was short, confident, and dripping with malice. The delivery arrived yesterday. The gala is the perfect venue. Too many witnesses, too much noise. It will look like a textbook heart attack brought on by the IPO stress. Just make sure your bags are packed. I stared at the transcript on my monitor, my hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a profound, burning rage. They were planning to kill me at my own celebration. They were going to use the crowning achievement of my career as the backdrop for my execution. "We have enough to go to the police for conspiracy," Marcus urged, leaning against my desk, his grey eyes shadowed with fatigue. "No," I countered, my voice hardening into absolute ice. "The police will tip them off. Julian will hire a high-priced criminal defense attorney, claim the encrypted texts were a twisted role-play or a misunderstanding, and drag this through court for years. I won't gamble my life or my company on a circumstantial conspiracy charge. I want them caught in the act. I want the trap to snap shut so hard they can't even breathe." That brings us back to the present. The silent, sterile luxury of the Stanford Hospital VIP suite. The grey, misty California dawn was finally beginning to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, somber shadows across the Italian leather furniture. Gavin Brooks sat in the armchair opposite my bed, a sleek leather briefcase resting on his knees. He looked immaculate, despite having spent the last 6 hours executing a financial decapitation strike. He took a slow sip from a paper coffee cup, his expression completely focused. "How are you holding up, Audrey?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "I feel like I've been hit by a freight train, but my mind is completely clear," I said, adjusting the pillows behind my back. The IV drip continued its slow, rhythmic beep. "Give me the damage report." Gavin opened his briefcase, pulling out a tablet displaying live financial monitors. "The protocol activated at exactly 10:42 p.m. last night, the moment your text came through. First, we initiated the immediate asset lock. Julian's secondary access to your personal checking and savings accounts has been terminated. The Centurion cards issued under your corporate umbrella were declined at 2:00 a.m. when he tried to book a private charter flight out of San Jose." I let out a cold, breathy laugh. He tried to secure transportation," Gavin corrected smoothly. "But Marcus was one step ahead. Every single asset tied to the Vance Legacy Trust is completely frozen to him. As of 3 hours ago, Julian is effectively broke. He has access to a single local checking account with less than $5,000 in it. He doesn't even own the car he drove to the hospital." "What about the tech?" I asked, my corporate instincts overriding the lingering physical pain in my chest. "The emergency medical proxy is in full effect," Gavin said, tapping the screen. Our chief technology officer has already taken over the temporary chairmanship of the board. The SEC has been quietly notified of an internal restructuring due to a temporary medical emergency, preventing any hostile stock movements. The Aura IPO is completely safe. Julian has zero authority to touch a single share. Before I could reply, the heavy walnut door of the suite opened, and Marcus Vance stepped into the room. He looked disheveled. His tie loosened his eyes bloodshot from a frantic, sleepless night of forensic data collection. He dropped a thick, translucent plastic folder onto my bedside table. "The preliminary toxicology report from the lab just came back," Marcus said flatly, pulling up a chair. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I stared at the folder, and they found trace amounts of a synthetic peptide compound called K402 in your bloodstream. Marcus explained, his voice turning into the clinical, detached tone of a former federal agent. "It's a highly restricted research chemical that causes acute myocardial spasms. If you had finished that entire glass of champagne Julian poured for you at L'Avenue, your heart would have failed completely within 20 minutes. The paramedics would have arrived to find a dead CEO, and the medical examiner would have ruled it an accidental cardiac arrest due to stress." I looked out the window, watching the morning fog roll over the Stanford campus. A cold, heavy silence descended on the room. Someone had tried to kill me. Not metaphorically, not financially. Literally, the man I had shared a bed with for 8 years, the man who had swore to protect me, had stood in a crowded room, looked into my eyes, and handed me a lethal dose of poison. "Are you all right, Audrey?" Gavin asked gently. "I'm better than all right, Gavin," I said, turning my head back toward them. My voice didn't shake. The grief that had been lurking in the shadows of my mind for months had finally evaporated, burned away by the pure, blinding clarity of survival. "The mourning period is officially over. Now let's talk about the trap." Marcus leaned forward, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Julian and Chloe have been holed up in a luxury Airbnb in Palo Alto since 3 a.m. They think you're either dead or completely incapacitated. They've spent the last 4 hours trying to log into Aura's secure server to initiate the patent transfer, but our cybersecurity team has been redirecting them to a dummy server. Every single keystroke they make, every desperate password attempt, is being logged as federal wire fraud. They are panicking," Gavin added, closing his briefcase with a sharp, decisive snap. "They realize the financial doors are locking, but they don't know who is locking them. They still think it's an automated corporate system or a glitch. Let them panic a little longer," I said. A cold, predatory calm settling over me. I want them to feel the absolute terror of watching their future vanish in real time. By noon today, I want the hammer to drop. To understand the absolute finality of the trap we set, you have to look back at the week leading up to my collapse at L'Avenue. The psychological toll of playing the oblivious, doting wife while harboring a federal cybercrimes investigator in my shadow was staggering. But the definitive turning point, the moment my lingering grief hardened into an unbreakable, diamond-sharp resolve, occurred during a seemingly casual lunch at the Pelican, a hyper-exclusive members-only restaurant overlooking the pristine waters of the Pacific in San Francisco. Chloe had initiated the invitation. She arrived 20 minutes late, wearing a pair of oversized Chanel sunglasses and a brilliant, flawless smile that had fooled me for 25 years. She looked radiant, completely unburdened by the fact that she was actively sleeping with my husband and planning my corporate execution. Watching her perform the role of the concerned, protective best friend was a surreal, almost cinematic experience. "Audrey, babe, you look completely exhausted," Chloe said, reaching across the reclaimed wood table to squeeze my hand with practiced synthetic warmth. "The stress of this impending IPO is eating you alive. You need to delegate. You can't keep carrying the entire weight of aura on your shoulders. It comes with the territory, Chloe, I replied, forcing an easy, compliant smile as the waiter poured our sparkling water. Success isn't passive. Chloe leaned in, her eyes glinting with a sharp, predatory curiosity behind her tinted lenses. She took a slow sip of her green juice before dropping the real anchor of the meeting. I was actually talking to Julian about this the other day. Have you updated your estate planning or your corporate proxy instructions recently, God forbid, if the exhaustion catches up to you and you need a prolonged medical sabbatical? Does the board have a clear directive on who takes over the cellular regeneration patent custody? My fork froze exactly halfway to my mouth. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of her question threatened to shatter my composure. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask of corporate poise. She sat across from me, pretending to care about my mental health, while quietly calculating how to benefit from my physical destruction. Gavin handles all of our legal structures, I answered smoothly, taking a bite of my salad. Everything is automated through our corporate counsel. Chloe nodded rapidly, changing the subject to a trivial gossip topic about a recent fashion show as if the question had never happened. But the damage was done. That single conversation disturbed me more than any surveillance photograph Marcus Vance had ever shown me. It was the first-hand experience of their deception, the absolute lack of humanity. That afternoon, I called Gavin from the back of my town car. We need to be completely ready, I told him. No half measures. I want the armor built to survive a nuclear blast. That brings us back to the night of the gala at L'Avenue. Julian had been orchestrating the dinner for weeks, under the guise of an intimate, romantic celebration, to mark the final regulatory approval of our new product line. Just the two of us, babe. He had whispered into my ear that morning, his hands resting on my waist in our kitchen. No work, no phones, no corporate distractions. I just want my wife back for one night. The venue was flawless. A private candlelit table overlooking the illuminated expanse of the Golden Gate Bridge. The city lights reflected across the black water like scattered diamonds. Julian played his part perfectly. He ordered my favorite vintage champagne, toasted to my brilliant mind, and held my hand across the linen tablecloth. It was a beautiful, meticulously rehearsed script, written by a man who had a vial of K402 burning a hole in his tuxedo pocket. Halfway through the main course, Julian reached out, his expression softening into a look of profound, convincing concern. You've built an incredible empire, Audrey, but promised me tonight. If anything ever happens, you'll remember that we built a life together, that you can trust me to protect your legacy. I know, Julian, I murmured, staring at the golden bubbles rising in my champagne flute. My instincts, the hyper-tuned survival mechanisms that had allowed me to dominate the venture capital world, were screaming. I knew the champagne was poisoned before I even touched it to my lips. I had seen Marcus's reports. I knew the chemical profile. But I also knew that if I didn't drink, if I didn't walk into the trap, they would retreat, adapt, and strike again when my guard was down. I needed them to believe they had succeeded. I took a tiny, controlled sip, letting the cold liquid barely touch my tongue before setting the glass down. Even that microscopic amount was enough. Within 40 minutes, the room began to tilt. A crushing, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest, and the ambient noise of the restaurant became distorted, muffled, and distant. Through the gathering darkness of my fading consciousness, I saw Julian's face lean forward. His eyes weren't filled with panic. They were filled with cold, calculating anticipation. I reached beneath the table, my trembling fingers, bypassing my phone's biometric lock by muscle memory alone, and sent the pre-formatted text to Gavin Dinner. Something's wrong. Then the world went black. The transition from a helpless casualty to an absolute executioner happened at exactly 5 a.m. on the morning of my awakening. As Julian and Chloe's whispers faded down the sterile corridor of Stanford Hospital, The invisible gears of the Vance Legacy Trust protocol locked into place with terrifying mathematical precision. Gavin Brooks stood up from his armchair, his phone held to his ear as he delivered a series of rapid, low-toned instructions to our offshore banking partners and the corporate security detachment at Aura headquarters. The corporate lawyer veneer was entirely gone. He was in full war room mode. "The asset isolation is absolute," Gavin said, hanging up and turning back to my bedside. At 5:15 a.m., the California Superior Court signed our emergency ex parte order. Because the initial toxicology report confirms the presence of a controlled lethal substance, we successfully argued asset dissipation and corporate sabotage risk. Julian has been entirely locked out of the Los Altos Hills estate. The smart locks were cycled 10 minutes ago. If he attempts to return to the property, the private security firm we stationed at the gates has strict directives to detain him for trespassing. What about his personal capital? I asked, my voice raspy, but my mind functioning with cold administrative efficiency. "Frozen," Gavin declared flatly. "Every single joint account, every secondary credit line, and every corporate expense account tied to your name or Aura Biocosmetics has been deactivated." Marcus also traced the IP addresses used during their 4 a.m. panic session. They were attempting to access our proprietary cellular regeneration patent vault from a luxury rental property in Palo Alto. The security firewall routed them into a secure digital sandbox. Not only did they fail to copy the code, but they also unwittingly verified their location and intent for the federal wire fraud filing. Ça me suffit, dit-on. The sheer beauty of the legal strategy was breathtaking. Julian and Chloe had spent over a year constructing an elaborate plot to kill me and inherit a multi-billion-dollar empire, completely unaware that they were walking straight into a legal meat grinder. They had operated under the arrogant assumption that I was a vulnerable, unsuspecting target. They never considered the possibility that the data scientist they were trying to murder had been tracking their every digital footprint for months. "The psychological shift is going to happen right about now," Marcus Vance remarked, stepping back into the room with a fresh cup of coffee and a grin that looked entirely feral. Julian just tried to use his black Amex card to pay the extended balance on their luxury rental. The transaction was declined with a code 43 stolen or frozen account. Our field operatives, stationed outside the rental, just reported that Chloe's personal Tesla Model S, which is leased under an Aura corporate subsidiary, was remotely disabled via our fleet management software. They are officially grounded, broke, and stranded. "I want to see it," I said, a cold, detached satisfaction washing over me. "I want to see the exact moment their reality implodes." Marcus tapped his tablet, casting a live high-definition video feed onto the large monitor mounted on the walnut-paneled wall of my suite. The feed came from a hidden long-range surveillance vehicle parked across the street from a secluded, ultra-modern Airbnb hidden in the trees of Palo Alto. The front door of their house flew open, and Julian stepped out onto the driveway. The polished, aristocratic composure he had maintained during our entire marriage was completely gone. His hair was disheveled, his designer shirt was wrinkled, and his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He was staring at his phone, frantically pressing the screen over and over again, likely watching his digital banking apps display a sequence of zero-balance warnings. A second later, Chloe stormed out behind him, holding a luxury leather duffel bag. She was screaming at him, her face contorted with rage and terror as she kicked the tire of her lifeless Tesla. The vehicle's digital dashboard remained dark, entirely unresponsive to her key fob. They looked like two rats trapped in a high-end maze. Realizing for the first time that the walls were closing in and the food supply had been permanently cut off. "They still don't know I'm awake," I whispered, watching the silent, chaotic argument play out on the screen. "They think you're in a medically induced coma, entirely at their mercy," Gavin said, opening his briefcase to retrieve the final arrest warrants and civil complaints. They think this is a banking glitch or a temporary corporate lockout triggered by the board's automated compliance algorithms. They have absolutely no idea that by noon today, the police San Francisco and the FBI will be waiting for them. Good, I said, leaning back against the pillows as the morning sun flooded the room with brilliant, blinding light. Let them scream at each other in the driveway a little longer. The real show hasn't even started. Watching the live feed from the Palo Alto rental was like watching a slow-motion demolition. Julian and Chloe were completely unraveling their polished tech elite personas, shedding like cheap skin under the pressure of sudden financial starvation. On the monitor, Chloe threw her designer duffel bag onto the concrete driveway, her hands wild with manic energy as she screamed at my husband. Julian looked completely paralyzed, his eyes glued to his iPhone screen as he desperately tried to call his private banker, his wealth managers. Anyone who could explain why his entire world had been wiped clean at 5 in the morning. He didn't understand that I hadn't just frozen his credit cards. I had entirely extracted him from the financial ecosystem of Northern California. By 1 p.m., the psychological pressure reached its boiling point. Julian, operating under the desperate, arrogant delusion that he still held the upper hand as my legal spouse, managed to hail a standard city cab using the emergency cash he kept hidden in his travel bag. He arrived at Stanford Medical Center alone, his face pale, his expensive linen shirt damp with sweat. He walked through the glass atrium with a calculated limp, trying to project the image of a distraught, grieving husband who hadn't slept a wink since his brilliant wife collapsed at L'Avenue. He took the elevator to the secure penthouse pavilion, entirely unaware that every single security guard he passed was on my personal payroll, and wearing an earpiece linked directly to Marcus Vance. When Julian reached the heavy double doors of my VIP suite, he stopped to smooth his hair and adjust his expression into one of tragic concern. He reached for the handle, expecting to walk into a room filled with weeping relatives, soft lighting, and an unconscious wife hooked up to a ventilator. Instead, the door swung open before he could touch it, and 2 towering corporate security officers stepped into his path, their expressions as unyielding as granite blocks. Julian blinked, stepping back, his aristocratic composure fracturing around the edges. What is the meaning of this? I'm Julian Vance. I am Audrey's husband. Let me through immediately. My wife is in that room. Mr. Vance. A cool, razor-sharp voice echoed from behind the guards. Gavin Brooks stepped into the hallway, an immaculate grey Tom Ford suit draped over his broad shoulders, holding a thick leather folder. His eyes held the detached clinical coldness of a surgeon about to perform an amputation. Gavin. Julian gasped, a flash of relief crossing his face before he noticed the absolute lack of warmth in the lawyer's eyes. Thank God you're here. What's going on with the accounts? There's some kind of catastrophic banking error. My cards are declined. Aura's server is locking me out, and these guards won't let me see my wife. Is Audrey okay? What do the doctors say? Gavin didn't answer. He simply opened the folder, retrieved a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the seal of the California Superior Court, and handed them directly to Julian's chest. You've been served, Julian, Gavin said flatly. Julian caught the paperwork automatically, his eyes scanning the bold, terrifying headers. Petition for dissolution of marriage, emergency ex parte restraining order, temporary asset seizure and corporate disinheritance order. What is this? Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he stared at the legal jargon. This is ridiculous. Audrey is in a coma. She didn't sign this. You're staging a corporate coup. Gavin, I'll have you disbarred. Audrey didn't sign those in a coma, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the hallway like a diamond through glass. The security guards stepped aside, revealing the interior of the suite. I was sitting upright in bed, fully dressed in a crisp, tailored black blazer, my hair perfectly styled, holding a cup of hot espresso. There were no monitors, no oxygen masks, no trace of the helpless victim he thought he had buried last night. I looked at him, my expression completely devoid of love, grief, or anger. I looked at him the way I looked at a failed quarterly spreadsheet. Julian's phone slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the polished hardwood floor. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute terror that filled his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "You're awake," Julian whispered, his legs visibly shaking as he took a step back into the hallway, his back hitting the opposite wall. "Audrey, babe, it was a mistake. The doctors, they said it was a heart attack. The doctors said it was K402, Julian." I interrupted, setting my espresso down with a soft, deliberate click. "A synthetic peptide purchased on the dark web via an anonymous account linked to an IP address registered at our guest house. You gave it to me in the champagne. But unfortunately for you, I don't drink the vintage when I know the bottle has been compromised." Julian's face went entirely translucent. He looked toward the elevators, his body tensing as his flight instincts kicked in. But before he could make a move, the heavy doors at the end of the corridor chimed, and 4 plainclothes detectives from the San Francisco Police Department, flanked by 2 special agents from the FBI, stepped onto the floor. Marcus Vance walked right beside them, holding a secure digital drive containing 14 months of forensic data geolocation tracking and the audio recording of Julian and Chloe's conversation outside my hospital door at 4 in the morning. "Julian Vance," the lead detective announced, pulling a pair of stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for attempted murder in the first-degree conspiracy to commit homicide and federal wire fraud. Hands behind your back." Julian didn't fight. He collapsed to his knees right there in the hallway, sobbing like a child as the steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The Grand Master of the perfect crime was reduced to a pathetic, shivering wreck on a hospital floor. While the police were reading Julian his Miranda rights, Marcus's tablet buzzed with an incoming live broadcast from our surveillance team in Palo Alto. "The second bird has flown right into the net," Marcus said, turning the screen toward me. At the luxury rental property, Chloe had finally managed to call a private town car, using a credit card she had hidden from her fashion company's accounting records. She had packed 3 massive suitcases, desperate to reach San Francisco International Airport to catch a one-way flight to Zurich. She thought she was escaping the financial glitch. She thought she could hide until Julian sorted out the mess. The video showed her town car being violently cut off at the intersection of University Avenue by 3 unmarked black SUVs. Within seconds, federal agents surrounded the vehicle, their weapons drawn. Chloe was dragged out of the back seat in broad daylight, her expensive sunglasses flying off her face as she was pushed against the hood of the car. She screamed, she kicked, she threw tantrums, crying out my name and claiming she was an innocent businesswoman. But the agents didn't care about her lifestyle brand or her 25 years of friendship with me. They read her the conspiracy charges, locked the cuffs around her wrists, and threw her into the back of a transport van. By 3 p.m., both Julian and Chloe were sitting in separate windowless interrogation rooms at the federal building downtown. They were isolated, broke and stripped of the digital armor they had used to build their lies. The beautiful part about criminals who operate out of pure greed is that they possess absolutely no loyalty. Marcus called me from his car an hour later, his voice filled with grim amusement. "Chloe broke within 15 minutes of sitting in the box," Marcus reported. "The second the FBI showed her the dark web logs and the financial transfers from Julian to her fashion company, she signed a full confession. She's currently pinning the entire murder plot on Julian, claiming he manipulated her and threatened her into helping him poison your champagne. She's begging for a plea deal." "And Julian?" I asked. looking out the window as the afternoon sun finally burned away the stubborn California fog, leaving the sky a brilliant, endless blue. Julian is demanding a lawyer he can't afford, Marcus said. Gavin just filed the formal asset freeze with the criminal court. Julian doesn't have the capital to retain a public defender, let alone a white-collar defense team. They're going to tear each other apart before the preliminary hearing even starts. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute finality of the moment sink into my bones. The invisible war was over. The trap had snapped shut, and the two monsters who had tried to erase me from my own life had just successfully destroyed their own. The Silicon Valley IPO is less of a financial milestone and more of a blood sport. It is the ultimate arena where a decade of sleepless nights, broken relationships, and brutal corporate warfare is boiled down to a single pulsing number on a trading floor ticker. Exactly 72 hours after Julian and Chloe were processed into the federal holding facility in San Francisco, I stood in the green room of the New York Stock Exchange. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catering espresso and the electric, low-humming anxiety of 20 Aura executives waiting for the opening bell. Through the glass partition, the trading floor below looked like a modern coliseum. Hundreds of brokers and market makers were huddled beneath the massive digital screens displaying our corporate logo, Aura Biocosmetics, AUR. The opening pricing is holding steady at $92 a share, Audrey, Gavin Brooks said, stepping up beside me. He looked perfectly at home in a bespoke midnight blue suit, his iPad displaying the live pre-market order book. The Wall Street analysts completely digested the corporate restructuring narrative we pushed out on Tuesday. The press views your sudden, brief hospitalization due to exhaustion as the ultimate proof of your relentless dedication to the company. The narrative isn't just surviving, it's thriving. And the media coverage of the arrests, I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the trading floor below. Contained, Gavin replied, a cold, clinical smile touching his lips. The federal prosecutors cooperated perfectly. They kept the specific mention of Aura's proprietary patents out of the initial indictment sheets to protect market stability. To the public, Julian and Chloe are just two greedy white-collar fraudsters who embezzled from a private estate. The murder conspiracy charge is buried deep in the penal code citations. The tech press is treating it like a scandalous domestic drama, not a corporate security breach. I took a slow sip of hot water with lemon, my mind drifting back to the cold, sterile room at Stanford Hospital. Just 3 days ago, I was fighting the residual effects of a lethal synthetic peptide. Today I was preparing to ring the bell on a $12 billion public offering. The human brain isn't designed to process that kind of psychological whiplash, but when you spend your entire life building an empire, survival becomes an automated algorithm. You don't feel the impact until the code stops running. They tried to bail out this morning, Marcus Vance said, joining us from the shadows of the green room door. He was wearing a dark suit that looked slightly too tight for his frame, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced paranoia of a cyber intelligence operative. I turned my head slightly. With what money? Chloe's family tried to leverage their house in Marin County to secure a bond, Marcus explained, a dry chuckle escaping his throat. But Gavin's team filed a secondary civil lien against her entire family trust yesterday afternoon, citing corporate asset dissipation. The bail bondsman took one look at the legal encumbrances and walked away. They are both staying in their orange jumpsuits until the federal grand jury convenes next month. Have they spoken to each other? They don't even look at each other during the transport, Marcus said. Their defense attorneys are already filing cross-complaints. Chloe's lawyer is leaks testing a narrative that Julian drugged her to. It's an absolute race to the bottom, Audrey. They're doing our job for us. I nodded slowly, a profound, pristine sense of peace settling over me. The legal system was moving exactly as we had engineered it to. There would be no dramatic courtroom showdowns, No grand philosophical debates about betrayal and love. There would only be the cold, heavy machinery of federal law crushing two amateurs who thought they could outcalculate a data scientist. 5 minutes to the bell, Mrs. Vance. A floor manager called out from the doorway, holding a clipboard and gesturing toward the balcony overlooking the trading floor. I set my cup down, smoothed the lapels of my tailored ivory blazer, and looked at my reflection in the glass. The dark circles under my eyes were expertly covered by our new cellular regeneration priming concealer, a poetic irony that wasn't lost on me. I looked strong. I looked untouchable. As I walked out onto the podium, flanked by Gavin Marcus and my core engineering team, the trading floor erupted into applause. The flashing cameras of the financial press blinded me for a split second, a vivid echo of the night at L'Avenue. But this time, there was no glass of champagne in my hand. There was no smiling predator standing at my side whispering false promises into my ear. I reached out and gripped the brass handle of the opening bell. Clang, clang, clang. The massive digital banners across the exchange flashed green. The numbers began to roll, skyrocketing from the initial $92 to $98, then crossing the $100 threshold within the first 90 seconds of trading. The ticker blurred with the sheer volume of institutional buy orders. Aura Biocosmetics was officially a public juggernaut. My net worth surged by $400 million in the span of 3 breaths. Gavin leaned closer over the roaring noise of the trading floor, his hand extended in a professional, congratulatory gesture. Congratulations, Audrey. You are officially the most powerful woman in biotech. I shook his hand. My eyes locked onto the green numbers illuminating the dark trading floor. I had spent 8 years believing that my wealth and my empire were things I shared with a partner, things that required protection and validation from a traditional life. I had allowed myself to become vulnerable to the oldest, most cliché human weakness, the desire to be loved by someone who didn't understand the cost of the crown. Julian and Chloe had underestimated the fundamental architecture of my mind. They thought that because I loved them, I was blind. They thought that because I was a wife and a friend, I couldn't become an executioner. They forgot that long before I was anyone's partner, I was an engineer. I was the person who designed the firewall, who wrote the protocol, and who understood that in any system, the corrupted data must be permanently purged. I looked out at the sea of cheering brokers, a cold, brilliant smile finally touching my face. My husband and my best friend were sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that their entire futures had been deleted by a single line of code. And my day was just beginning.